my life was very peaceful and wonderful and so forth, and another might say it's chaotic and full of pain and violence. In this driving of this dynamic, what brings it forth? What causes, one localization, me, versus another to say, my experience was good, my experience was bad?
What causes your mind at night sometimes to assume the form of a nightmare, and sometimes to assume the form of a beautiful dream? The same mind assuming the form of these two very different experiences. Your mind is a field of potential in which there are all sorts of residual energies that are left over from your life, from your experience. And it is these energies that coalesce in the dream state to appear as a particular dream. And each of these dreams is a partial expression of the energies that constitute your mind.
But what causes, that accumulation from this universe to localize in my dream mind or my sleeping mind?
Well, consider consciousness an infinite, formless field. Now, it's not possible to imagine an infinite field, because an infinite field has no dimensions. It is smaller than a point. Something with no dimensions is not extended in space. But we can't think about something with no dimensions. So, as a concession to our desire to speak of these things, visualize consciousness as a vast, empty, homogeneous, formless field, which is full of potential. All possible things that could exist in this field in potential. So, in order to realize its potential, in order to make it real, to make it perceivable, consciousness must vibrate within itself. So its formless self, which has no frequency and no amplitude, must begin to vibrate within itself. So its formless self now begins to take on a frequency and an amplitude. Its formless self begins to appear in form, but consciousness cannot directly see that form, because the infinite cannot see the finite. In order to see the finite, consciousness needs to localize itself as a finite subject. In order to see a finite object, consciousness must localize itself as a finite subject. It is only through the agency of the finite subject that consciousness can know its own potential in form. So, how its own potential, how infinite consciousness appears will depend upon the condition of the finite mind through which it is known. So depending upon the structure or the condition of the mind, so reality, consciousness, will appear in accordance with it. So every mind, that's each of us, every finite mind is a slightly different viewpoint. Consciousness has, as it were, has taken a slightly different pathway to localize itself as each of our minds. And the pathway that consciousness has to take in order to end up as each of our minds conditions that mind. And therefore
understand
each
that.
of our minds are different, and therefore each of the experiences we have is different.
But I guess it raises the question, why me? Well, out of this universe, this infinite universe of possibilities, that localization onto me, why is it in one case wonderful, in the other case chaotic?
Because all things exist in potential within consciousness, the full spectrum of experience. And depending on the point of view that this full spectrum is viewed from, so what is experienced will differ from extremely positive to extremely negative, from the dark to the light. The whole range lives in potential in consciousness, but it's depending on where that potential is viewed from will dictate how it appears.
I guess where it's viewed from, I guess I would understand to be like, it's me that's going to have the next thought.
Yeah, but imagine that instead of taking the shape of your mind, a consciousness had taken the shape of Finn's mind. Where is Finn? Finn's over here. Taken the shape of Finn's mind. That's it. Finn is another localization of infinite consciousness. But through the agency of Finn's mind, reality looks very different from how it looks from the point of view of your mind or my mind. There are some similarities between the way reality appears, between your perspective and my perspective, because our minds are conditioned in very similar ways. But Finn's mind is conditioned in a very different way. It also shares some of the conditioning of our minds, but it is conditioned in a different way, therefore it sees a different world. It is a different viewpoint. Its viewpoint of reality is filtered through a different mind. Likewise, if you had been brought up in an Al-Qaeda family, your mind would share some similarities with the Christians that lived next door to you. But there would also be differences in the way your minds were conditioned, which would dictate the kind of thoughts you have and the kinds of actions you engage in.
So there's something hardwired into this. This...
Yes, once our mind has crystallized in the form of this body-mind, then there is a certain hardwiring to our minds, yes. For instance, the fact that we're speaking English and not Chinese, that is hardwired. It's conditioning, it's just conditioning, but it is a conditioning that is hardwired into each of our finite minds.
From an earlier incarnation, or what?
Yes, we have to be open to the possibilities that the conditioning of our minds now may not just have been laid down in this lifetime. We have to be, in fact, it's very difficult to account for the specific conditioning of each of our minds if we only refer to experiences that we've had in this lifetime. If we admit the possibilities that each of these localizations of infinite consciousness may have localized innumerable times before and then disbanded and then relocalized and then dissolved and then relocalized, it's much easier to account for the different conditionings in each of our minds. The fact that some person may have this irrational fear of small spaces, and yet they've always lived in a mansion all their life and have never actually experienced being confined in a small space. How could we account for that irrational fear? If we admit the possibilities that this mind may have had other experiences prior to this particular lifetime, then it's much easier to understand how such a phobia might arise.
But this localization, the implication seems to be that this is something that maintains an identity that permits it to draw from all of these infinite possibilities.
Yes, it's true. It has the finite mind has its ultimate identity is of course infinite consciousness, but at the same time, each of our finite minds has a certain pattern to it, or a certain habit to it. And that habit could last from one lifetime to another. At some stage, everything is destined to dissolve in awareness, because everything is only, all of our minds are ripples in awareness. I use Bernardo Kastrup's analogy of a whirlpool in a river. You're familiar with that. You've probably heard me say it before, but let me just briefly say it again. Bernardo imagines consciousness like a river, and each of our minds are like whirlpools in the river. There's no such thing as a whirlpool. You can't pluck a whirlpool out of a river. In other words, the whirlpool is not a thing in its own right. It is just the activity of the water. Just as our minds are not entities in their own right, they are just the activity of pure knowing or consciousness. Nevertheless, each whirlpool has a particular structure to it. Many of them are similar, but each one is unique. Now, when the whirlpool disbands, this would correspond to the death of the body. The energies that went into maintaining the structure of the whirlpool dissipate into the broader medium of the river, and at some point the coherence of the whirlpool dissolves. That's the death of the body. However, the energies that went into the make of the whirlpool still remain as ripples in the stream. Well, this would be the existence of the residual energies of our mind still remaining in consciousness after death. And there's, just as these ripples in the stream may coalesce downstream and form the nucleus of a new whirlpool, so consider the possibilities that the residues of our mind, which are left over in consciousness after the death of the body, may coalesce or localize and form the basis of a new mind. Now that new mind, just let me say one more thing, just as the new whirlpool is based on or is formed out of the residual energies of the old whirlpool, and therefore will bear some resemblance to it, likewise the new mind that forms will bear some resemblance to the residues of the old mind out of which it is made. All the tendencies of the finite mind are seeking to return to its source. All finite minds seek love, peace, happiness above all else. So what the finite mind is really seeking is its origin, its home, its source. In other words, the finite mind is longing to be divested of everything that keeps it finite or limited. So everything, everyone and everything is seeking the light of awareness. Everything is seeking its source. So as the finite mind approaches its source, so to speak, as it gets closer and closer to it, the energies behind its driving force, they begin to dissipate, because the only purpose of those energies all the energy that the separate self expends during its life is only directed towards finding happiness. The closer it gets to that happiness, the more the energies die down. And in the moment of happiness, there is no dynamism. You don't want to go anywhere because you're at the place you want to be. So the energies then, there's no more residual energy. So it's the same with the mind. All minds are tending towards their source. And the closer they get to their source, the more the energies that propel them die down and dissipate until at the moment of merging, those energies come to an end. Now, it's not impossible that such a mind, in other words, that a mind that had completely merged with its source, it's not impossible that its source would not, and I'm now caricaturing the mind and its source, it's not impossible that the source would not say to such a mind, I'm not going to allow you simply to rest in me for eternity. I'm going to send you back out again into manifestation. And this time your sole purpose is to speak of my presence.
I would like to go back for a second with the concept of the different whirlpools that represent us. And been struggling a little bit with what to expect at the moment of death. Would like to know what the teachings suggest in regard to that. What is it going to happen? My name is Marco. What is it going to happen to Marco then? What Marco should I expect when the body will go?
Expect roughly what happens to you when you fall asleep at night.
Yeah, that's what I thought, but I don't remember anything. I might as well. But I don't remember anything about my deep sleep. There is really nothing. It's closer to annihilation.
Well, when you fall asleep at night, you go through a dream state. You don't just go directly to deep sleep. In other words, a part of your mind, as you fall asleep, begins to dissolve. That is your perceptions of the world. So that your ability to perceive dissolves, but that leaves the deeper layers of your mind exposed. Those layers of your mind are in fact present in the waking state, but they are eclipsed by the brightness of the world, by the dominance of our perceptions. But when perceptions dissolve, as they do when we fall asleep, the deeper layer of your finite mind, your personal unconscious, comes to the surface and expresses itself in dreams. It is also part of your individual mind, but it's the deeper layer of your mind, the mind that is not accessible in the waking state under normal circumstances due to the dominance of perceptions. So for a while, in the dream state, you experience the deeper layers of your mind, and then at a certain point, those also dissolve, and you just experience your pure consciousness. And then again, your consciousness takes the form of the structures of your mind. First of all, the deeper layers of your mind, and then slowly layers and layers are added until you find yourself in the waking state again. You consciousness haven't really gone through a series of states, but you've just assumed the activity of imagining, that's the dream state, and then perceiving, that's the waking state. And you go through this cycle every 24 hours. You, awareness, go through this cycle. You color yourself in the form of imagining and seem to become the dream state. You color yourself in the form of perceiving and you seem to become the waking state. Then you dissolve the experience of perceiving inside of yourself and you seem to return to the dream state. Then you dissolve the experience of imagining in yourself and you remain as you are. And then with the next out-breath, you take the shape of imagining and you become the next dream. You take the shape of perceiving and you become the next waking state. That is the next day. So this happens on a 24-hour cycle. It also happens on a much shorter cycle every time a thought or perception appears and dissolves. That's a much quicker cycle. It happens every few seconds. A thought, consciousness takes the shape of thinking, and it dissolves, takes the shape of perceiving, and it dissolves into itself. So at the end of every thought and perception, consciousness is tasting itself again. In between each of King Lear's lines, John Smith briefly knows himself as John Smith before he takes the next line again. So there's a much shorter cycle that lasts just the length of a thought or a perception, and there's a longer cycle that lasts every 24 hours, and then there's a longer cycle that lasts a lifetime. But they're cycles of the same activity, just on different timescales. Every time a new thought arises, it is a new incarnation of the finite mind. Because in the absence, what we call our finite mind is the activities of thinking and perceiving, by which I mean thinking, feeling, imagining, sensing. But let's just call it thinking and perceiving. Every time that pure knowing or consciousness assumes the form of thinking and perceiving, there is an incarnation of not a new self, but a new activity. And then it dissolves. And then there is a new activity of thinking and perceiving. That's a new incarnation. So the mind is always dying and being reincarnated, not just from lifetime to lifetime, not just from one day to another, but from moment to moment. Consciousness is perpetually assuming the form of thought and perception and then dissolving into itself. And then assuming the form of the next thought and perception, then dissolving into itself. Now this dissolving into itself, in the absence of thought and perception, there is no time or space there. So in the presence of thought and perception, we have no recollection of that time. That's why you say, I don't remember deep sleep. Because from the perspective of the waking state, there is nothing objective in deep sleep to remember. So that's why deep sleep always seems to take just a moment. Doesn't even take a moment. The moment we fall asleep is the same moment we wake up in the waking state. So it's like that. Consciousness is continually incarnating itself in the form of thinking and perceiving, and then dissolving thought and perception into itself, assuming the next activity of thought and perception, dissolving into itself, assuming the next activity, always reincarnating itself. So when our mind, at night, our mind dissolves into consciousness, but then it re-emerges again. It's not lost forever in consciousness. Such a mind could not be reconstituted again. There would be no continuity between thoughts. You couldn't have two thoughts that related one to another if, when that mind completely dissolved, it didn't leave its trace in consciousness from which it could be reconstituted again. So it's the difference between a mind that subsides in consciousness and a mind that completely loses its form.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. How would the same mind be scared of a small room after the...
Because the fear of small spaces would remain as a trace or a habit in consciousness, and that habit would go into the make of the next mind, just as the disbanding whirlpool will leave ripples in the river. Long after the whirlpool has disappeared, there'll be ripples in the river which will bear some of the characteristics of the original whirlpool. Those ripples will go into the make of the next whirlpool. So what would be the best preparation for death? It would be the best preparation for sleep. And what would be the best preparation for sleep? To abide in yourself, knowingly. To be knowingly yourself. That would be the best preparation for whatever you are to experience after the dissolution of the body. Just as it is the best preparation for falling asleep, for whatever dream you are going to have, or indeed the best preparation for whatever experience we are to experience in the waking state, the best preparation for whatever might happen to each of us tomorrow would be to be knowingly this presence. That would be the best preparation for whatever is going to occur to each of us tomorrow or next week or next year, however wonderful or awful it may be.